So today I'd like to talk more about pacing, which I think is very important for horror games and very important in general. Certainly, I look at movies and I think about pacing a lot, and it's a good experiment if you're interested in pacing. Is to, I don't know if people have actual DVD players or whatever, but if they have the little clock readout, or if you have the button on their remote to show the time, is to check the time and think about what you're thinking and feeling at that particular point, and sort of reflect on the movie and figure out what point in time you're at. And I think you'll find that some movies are essentially, good movies, but the pacing is sort of messed up. And so I really like John Carter. Not many people like John Carter, and I think part of the problem was that Disney essentially said this is a huge flop before they released it, which was probably for some internal politics, and the new CEO wanted to stab the old CEO and blah blah blah. But I mean, like, as a movie, I wouldn't say John Carter is a great movie, but I enjoyed it. I think it's a good movie, but I think part of the main problem that really where John Carter failed was an issue of pacing. So if you look at, you check the time, there's a lot of time of him, as a cowboy, and him, falling asleep or whatever in the cave, and the whole narrative framing device. And that doesn't really have a bearing on the actual story of John Carter being on Mars. And so that's almost sort of wasted time. That's time people are sort of disengaging from the story. And, if they edited the movie a little differently, I feel like people would have had a more positive response. And I think this is actually a bigger problem that plagues a lot of movies, because for whatever reason now, it used to be movies were 90 minutes, and 90 minutes is a very good length. It's a very good length for a movie. It's a very good length for keeping your interest, and you could probably do a graph of, what happens where in a 90-minute movie, especially for a horror movie, because as I mentioned, do I have my book? I think it's somewhere. I don't know where I put it, but my philosophy of horror book that I always keep mentioning, there's basically key events in the complex discovery plot, which is what a lot of horror movies follow, and so you can basically probably draw a picture of them and figure out when they happen in a lot of 90-minute horror movies, and then sort of figure out the optimal formula based on that. Which would be really interesting, and if I had a lot more time I would do that, but, well, maybe after Neverending Nightmare ships. But I think, you run into this problem well, sorry, going back to what I was saying, is that now they're making all these action movies like 2 hours and 30 minutes, 2 hours and 40 minutes, like The Lone Ranger was an insane, I don't know, it was like 2 hours and 40 minutes, or 2 hours and 20 minutes or something, and really, like, maybe they had 90 minutes of good stuff, maybe they could have cut it to 75 minutes, but I mean, like, I was bored for a large portion of that movie, and certainly there were, some interesting things, like Johnny Depp being funny, that could have kept my interest, but, I lost during all the slow sections. But tying back to games, so for a horror game, the pacing is extremely important, and this is one of the things that I've been upfront about, is that we're trying to keep our playthrough length short, like 2 hours, probably 1.5 hours, maybe 90 minutes is sort of where I'm looking at for a playthrough, because I feel like that's sort of, again, we can sort of model that, plot, that rising action conclusion, that sort of payoff, that tension balance, in movies in our game. And so then we'll have multiple endings and different things you can do in the playthrough. But I think that for one playthrough, we want to keep it, I'm looking probably 60 to 90 minutes for one playthrough, just because I think we can really balance the tension without, people getting bored, or things being repetitive or whatever, but one of the things is that there's no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. And that's a quote from Hitchcock, which I had to read off my monitor. And that's something with the pacing that I'm very cautious about, and something that I play around with a lot, is sort of the idea of this dead space, not like the game, but these times where essentially there are no enemy encounters, there are no jump scares. The times in between those are extremely important, and the game does not feel the same because, I talked about this show floor demo I took, and basically I cut out all the non-jump scares and all the non enemy sections and compressed it into 10 minutes. And I mean, I think it's probably better for a show floor demo because people can say, oh, this is neat, this is neat, this is neat, they're doing some neat things, and I mean, honestly, like, I sat down to play, I think, Resident Evil 6 at E3, and I played it for like 3 minutes, and like, okay, maybe it was 5, I don't know, but I mean, you play these games and you're just kind of like, okay, whatever, I get the point, and your idea is to sort of, you're trying to get the point rather than appreciate it, but when you take that home, I think, if it's all enemies and all jump scares, well, firstly, the jump scares aren't going to be as effective. And all enemies, then it's going to be more of an action game. So I think you really have to come up with the idea of tension and pacing, and sort of I try and come up with sort of escalation within each level, and sort of the theme of descent. And so well, I don't want to give any spoilers in this video, but I mean, we're very careful and cautious to the way we structure each nightmare, such that it has its own sort of, rising action, climax, conclusion, and then that sort of leads in, and so it's these sort of steps of tension, and, well, I guess in the graph they would be going up, but at least in my mind things are getting crazier and crazier, so it's a descent. And so the pacing is extremely important and something we have to be very careful about. And I mean, in general, I think video game pacing is, and movie pacing, as I talked about before, is important. And if you have action set piece after action set piece after action set piece, it can sometimes get kind of weird, and I mean, like, you don't appreciate them as much, and so sometimes, having the time where you're sort of wandering around, or sometimes the puzzles to break up the monotony, or even like the segment in Uncharted 2, I think, where you just sort of walk around the town and say hi to people. I mean, I think there's other ways you can sort of play with your pacing to make people appreciate the action more, and certainly if you have multiple mechanics in your game, like, stealth and regular action, fighting or whatever, then you can, use those and try and balance them to create interesting pacing. So I feel like I'm getting a little rambly, but definitely pacing is extremely important, especially in a horror game, and if you're making a game, it's something you should think about, and I sort of challenge you to, keep checking the time in a movie and figure out, try and get a feel for pacing a movie and pacing I guess pacing a game is a little tougher because you really don't know what the final playtime is. But I think, you can learn a lot from movies in terms of pacing and how they set it up that is applicable to games. So, thanks for watching.